abandoned in the freezing wilderness by her own family, and left to perish. A destitute young woman had nothing but a pocket knife and a single biscuit. Desperately clawing a primitive shelter out of a collapsed, forgotten root cellar, she had no idea the frozen earth concealed a staggering, long-lost treasure. Her breathtaking discovery wouldn't just save her life. It would hand her the ultimate proof of a new identity, and the power to build an untouchable, magnificent legacy from the dirt. Settle in close and let us tell you her story. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Sarah Hale had been shaped by quiet losses and practical work. She was born in Missouri, in a small house her grandfather, Elias Hale, had built with his own hands. Elias was a stonemason and a carpenter, a man who spoke little but whose hands were fluent in the languages of wood grain and stress lines, of mortar and level. Her parents were gentle people, lost to a fever that swept through their county when Sarah was just 7. A loss she remembered not as a sharp cry, but as a profound and echoing silence that settled over the house. After that, she lived with Elias. He never spoke of grief, but he handed her a small block of pine and a whittling knife and showed her how to carve the shape of a bird, his large, calloused thumb guiding her smaller one. He taught her the names of trees by their bark and the names of tools by their use. He taught her that everything could be mended if you were patient enough, and that the world was full of things people threw away that still had good use in them. Her most treasured possession was his whetstone, a rectangle of grey slate worn into a smooth saddle by decades of sharpening blades. He had given it to her the year before he passed, his hand closing over hers as she held it. "Keep a keen edge," he'd said, one of the few pieces of direct advice he ever offered, on your tools and on your mind. When he died, her aunt and uncle, Marcus and Eleanor, took her in. They were not unkind, but they were burdened people, and they saw Sarah as one more mouth, one more chore. She was quiet and capable, mending their clothes and helping in the garden, but her presence in their cramped home was a constant, unspoken reminder of their obligations. When Marcus announced they were selling the farm and joining a wagon train for the Oregon territories, he spoke of opportunity and a new life, but Sarah understood it was a chance to shed the old one, and she was part of that old life he wished to leave behind. The ejection, when it came, was as quiet and administrative as a line drawn through a name in a ledger. They had been traveling for 3 months, the journey grinding down the people and the animals. The Idaho foothills were a relentless landscape of steep, rocky grades and punishing winds that tore at the canvas wagon covers. One morning, as the train prepared to move out from a cold camp, Sarah's uncle, Marcus, approached her wagon. He did not meet her eye. He pointed a thumb at the rear axle of her small, overloaded prairie schooner, the one that had belonged to her grandfather. "The axle's cracked, Sarah," he said, his voice flat. "It won't make the next pass. We've got to lighten the load if the rest of us are to get through." Sarah had checked the wagon herself the night before, greasing the hubs and inspecting the timbers as Elias had taught her. The axle was sound. She knew this with the certainty of a well-driven nail, but she looked at her uncle's face, at the hard set of his jaw, and the way his gaze fixed on the distant mountains, and she understood the truth of the situation had nothing to do with the wood. It was a judgment passed. She was the weight they wished to shed. He told her a smaller, faster party of prospectors was a day behind them on the trail. They would surely pick her up, he assured her, his words thin and brittle in the morning air. He gave her a canvas sack containing a slab of salted bacon, a handful of dried beans, a tin of matches, and 2 blankets. He did not help her unhitch her oxen. He simply turned and walked back to his own wagon, calling for his family to get moving. Sarah stood still, her hands loose at her sides. She did not argue or plead or cry. To do so would be to ask for a kindness that was not there to be given. She watched as Eleanor, her aunt, glanced back once with a flicker of something, pity or perhaps shame, before turning away. The wagons creaked forward one by one, their canvas tops shrinking against the vast, indifferent sky. She stood there until the sound of their departure was absorbed by the wind, leaving only the rustle of sagebrush and the immense silence of the high country. She was alone. She gathered the sack of provisions, looped the blankets over her shoulder, and began to walk. Not following the trail, but turning towards a line of cottonwoods that suggested a creek and, with any luck, shelter. The journey was not one of miles, but of shrinking daylight and falling temperature. Sarah walked with a steady, ground-covering pace, her eyes scanning the terrain not for its beauty, but for its utility. The sun, which had been a comfortless white disk in the morning sky, began to slide towards the jagged peaks to the west, painting the undersides of the clouds in brutal shades of orange and purple. The wind grew teeth, a biting cold that found its way through the weave of her wool coat. She followed the ghost of a dry creek bed, its stones and gravel a treacherous path, but one that led downward into the folds of the land, where there might be some reprieve from the ceaseless wind. The landscape was made of granite and sage and silence. She saw no sign of animal life beyond a hawk circling high overhead, a lonely speck in the deepening grey. Fatigue settled into her bones, a heavy, pulling ache in her legs and lower back. Every step became a conscious effort. She knew that stopping to rest was a luxury she could not afford. To stop was to let the cold win. A fine, hard sleet began to fall, not melting, but bouncing off the frozen ground like pellets of sand. It stung her face and hands, and she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, the rough wool a small, inadequate comfort. She was looking for an overhang, a cave, any kind of natural shelter carved from the rock. As dusk bled the remaining color from the world, she saw it. It wasn't a cave, but a human disturbance in the landscape. A dark depression on the slope of a hill, marked by a jumble of grey, lichen-spotted stones that looked out of place amongst the smooth contours of the earth. It looked like a collapse, a place where the ground had given way. Hope, a feeling she had carefully suppressed all day, flickered within her. A collapse meant a cavity. A cavity meant shelter. With the last of her strength, she scrambled up the slick, rock-strewn slope towards the dark patch, the sleet now coming down in a thick, hissing sheet that obscured the world beyond a few feet. The acquisition was not a choice, but an act of desperation. What she found was the ruin of a root cellar, a dugout burrowed into the hillside. The roof, once made of thick sod laid over timber beams, had long ago collapsed inward, leaving a gaping hole open to the sky. The doorway was a tumble of rotted wood and fallen field stones, choked with weeds and dirt. It was little more than a pit in the earth, but it was a pit with 3 solid, stone-lined walls that broke the force of the wind. It smelled of damp earth, of decay, of the deep, cold scent of a place that has not seen the sun in years. Sarah scrambled down into the depression, the loose soil giving way under her boots. The space inside was small, perhaps 8 feet square. The floor was a chaotic mess of fallen roof timbers, sod, and rocks that had tumbled from the walls. But the back wall and the 2 side walls were mostly intact, built of carefully fitted, unmortared field stones, the work of someone who knew how to read the shapes of rocks and make them hold together. This was work Elias would have respected. It was a broken place, abandoned and forgotten, but it was shelter. She set down her meager supplies in a corner where a slight overhang offered some protection from the sleet falling through the hole in the roof. Using her hands, she began to clear a small section of the floor, pulling away the smaller rocks and chunks of dirt, trying to create a level space to lie down. The work was slow and punishing. Her fingers, already numb with cold, were scraped raw by the rough stone. But the labor warmed her, chasing away some of the deep chill that had settled in her marrow. As she worked, she felt a sense of strange connection to the person who had built this place. Someone had chosen this spot. Someone had dug into this hill and patiently laid these stones, creating a space to preserve the fruits of their labor. It was a place of forethought and care, even in its ruin. For the first time since watching the wagons disappear, she felt a sliver of something other than cold resolve. This broken shelter, this unwanted hole in the ground, was now hers. It was all she had. The discovery came from the simple act of trying to make the place habitable. Over the next 2 days, the storm passed, leaving behind a world scoured clean and frozen. Sarah worked tirelessly, driven by the primal need for a secure shelter. Using a stout branch as a lever, she pried the larger of the fallen timbers out of the cellar and dragged them away. She cleared the rubble from the floor, stone by stone, until she had a relatively flat surface of packed earth. It was during this process, while shifting a large, flat piece of granite near the back wall, that she felt it give way beneath her. It wasn't the soft crumble of earth, but a hollow thud, a resonance that suggested a void beneath. Curiosity, sharp and immediate, cut through her fatigue. She knelt and worked her raw fingers around the edges of the stone. It was heavy, but it shifted. With a great effort, she lifted it, grunting as she heaved it aside. Beneath it was not dirt, but a carefully constructed cavity, about 2 feet square and a foot deep, lined with thick, blackened oilcloth. And nestled inside that protected space was a small tin box, the kind used for holding documents or deeds. It was rusted at the seams, but otherwise solid. Her heart began to beat, a heavy, steady rhythm against her ribs. With trembling hands, she lifted the box. It was heavier than it looked. She carried it to the entrance of the dugout, where the pale winter light was strongest, and worked at the clasp with the tip of her knife. It sprang open with a rusty groan. The contents were wrapped in another layer of oilcloth. She carefully unfolded the stiff, waxy fabric. Inside was a neat stack of Union Army scrip, a small leather pouch, heavy with the unmistakable weight of gold coins, and a bundle of papers tied with a leather thong. At the very top of the papers was a letter. The ink faded, but still perfectly legible. The script was careful and clear. It began, "To whoever finds this place." She read on, her breath held tight in her chest. The letter was from a man named Private Thomas Ballard. He had fought at Antietam, had seen enough of death to last a dozen lifetimes, and had walked away from the war. He came west, seeking a life of peace, and changed his name to Thomas Hale, using his mother's maiden name. The papers confirmed his story. There was a land grant for 160 acres, this very parcel, filed in the name of Thomas Hale. There was a yellowed official-looking document declaring Private Thomas Ballard deceased, killed in action. And there was the letter, which explained he had built this small homestead, lived here for 10 years, and had passed with no kin to leave it to. He was leaving what little he had saved for the next soul who needed a place to start over. Sarah's hands shook as she reread the name. Hale. The same as hers. The same as her grandfather's. It may have been a coincidence, a simple twist of fate that the name he chose was her own. Or perhaps, in the tangled roots of family trees, there was a distant, forgotten connection. It didn't matter. In that moment, a man she had never known, a deserter who had sought peace in this lonely place, had reached across 30 years of silence and given her a name, a small fortune, and the deed to the ground beneath her feet. The rebuilding began not with a grand plan, but with a single, necessary journey. The gold coins and script in the tin box were more than just money. They were tools, the means to turn a ruin into a home. Sarah carefully packed the box, shouldered her blankets, and walked for 2 days, following the creek bed until it met a larger stream, and then a rough track that passed for a road. The track eventually led her to Providence, a small, gritty supply town that served the miners and ranchers in the region. It was a place of log buildings, muddy streets, and the constant ring of a blacksmith's hammer. She felt the eyes of the town on her as she walked down the main street, a young woman, alone, her face smudged with dirt and her clothes torn. But her grandfather had taught her to carry herself with purpose, and she did. She went first to the general store, a long, low building that smelled of coffee, leather, and salted fish. She bought an axe with a hickory handle, a crosscut saw, a broad-headed froe for splitting shingles, and a heavy iron skillet. She bought sacks of flour, beans, and salt, and a small, squat cast-iron stove that would be the warm heart of her new home. The sum she paid would have seemed a fortune a week ago. Now, it was a sound investment. The problem was transport. Her purchases were too heavy to carry. The storekeeper directed her to the livery, where a freighter named Silas Reed was loading his wagon. He was a tall, weathered man in his 50s, with a quiet demeanor and eyes that seemed to have seen every kind of trouble the trail could offer. He listened to her request to haul her goods to the old Ballard place without a flicker of surprise. Folks thought that place was haunted, he said, his voice a low rumble. Or just collapsed. Ain't nobody been out there in years. Sarah simply met his gaze. I'm making it my home. Silas studied her for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. Load them up, he said. The journey back was made in near silence. Silas handled his team with an economy of motion and voice, and Sarah sat beside him, watching the familiar landscape pass. When they arrived, he helped her unload the stove, a task that took both their strengths, and set it carefully inside the dugout. Before he left, he looked at the stone walls, the cleared floor, and the pile of salvaged timbers. Good stonework, he noted. That'll hold. It was the highest praise she could have imagined. Over the next weeks, Sarah worked from dawn until dusk, using the new axe and saw. She felled several straight, slender pines from a grove down by the creek. She squared them into beams and rebuilt the roof structure, setting the heavy timbers into the notches in the stone walls. She cut thick squares of sod from the hillside, heavy with grass and roots, and laid them carefully over the roof beams, creating a living roof that would keep out the rain and snow. She used the frow to split cedar shakes and fashioned a solid door. A woman from Providence, a widow named Mary O'Connell, who had seen her in town, rode out one afternoon with a warm pot of stew and a loaf of bread. Like Silas, she said little, but her eyes took in the progress. The neat stack of firewood, the smoke curling from the new stovepipe. The community was not formed through words, but through quiet acts of practical recognition. They saw the work, and they respected it. The dugout, once a collapsed pit of despair, slowly transformed into a home. And Sarah Hale, once an outcast, slowly became part of the place. Her position in the world began to settle and take root, much like the sod on her new roof. The turning point came when she took Thomas Ballard's papers back to Providence. She went to the land agent's office, a cramped room smelling of paper and stale pipe smoke, presided over by a man named Mr. Abernathy. He was a cautious, meticulous man, and with spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He listened to her story, his expression unreadable, and examined the land grant and the deserter's letter with painstaking care. He held the old paper up to the light, tracing the faded signatures and the official seal. "This is highly irregular, Miss Hale," he said. But there was a current of excitement beneath his dry tone. The documents were old, but they were authentic. The claim filed by Thomas Hale was legal and had never been challenged. Because Sarah shared the name, and because the letter acted as a form of primitive will from a man with no other heirs, Abernathy saw a clear, if unusual, path. He spent an afternoon drafting new documents, transferring the claim officially into her name. "You own this land, free and clear," he declared, stamping the final page with a satisfying thud. 160 acres. The news traveled through Providence in the quiet way that news does in small towns. She was no longer just the strange girl living in the old ruin. She was Sarah Hale, the owner of the Ballard place. People began to know her name. When she came to town for supplies, the storekeeper, Mr. Henderson, would set aside a particular cut of bacon he knew she favored. Mary O'Connell started bringing her cuttings from her garden, hardy herbs and potato starters, and showing her how to plant them in a terraced plot Sarah had carved out of the hillside. Silas Reed made her homestead a regular stop on his freight route, never arriving empty-handed. Sometimes it was a sack of oats for the small pony she had purchased. Other times, a bundle of old newspapers to read by the fire. Small rituals began to form. She would have a pot of strong coffee ready for Silas when he arrived, and they would sit on the bench she had built by her new front door, speaking of the weather and the price of goods. Her unwanted shelter had transformed from a burden into a refuge, a place of warmth and function. The dugout was not fancy, but it was hers. It was filled with the purpose of her own labor, respected by her neighbors, and solid against the wind. Winter settled deep in the foothills, blanketing the landscape in a profound and peaceful silence. Sarah stood in the doorway of her dugout home, a tin cup of hot coffee, warming her hands. The air was so cold It was sharp in her lungs, and the smoke from her chimney rose in a straight, unwavering line into the pale blue sky. Inside, the small stove radiated a steady, comforting warmth. The space she had carved from the earth and rebuilt with her own labor was now a complete and living thing. On the rough-hewn mantel she had built above the stove sat two objects side by side. One was the whetstone her grandfather had given her, its grey slate surface worn into a gentle curve from a lifetime of keeping edges true. Next to it was a small, smooth river stone, almost perfectly round, that she had found in the bottom of Thomas Ballard's tin box. It had no value, but it was the one personal object he had chosen to keep. It felt right that they should rest together. A tool from the man who taught her how to build a life, and a token from the man who had, sight unseen, given her a place to build it. She thought of her uncle, Marcus, and the cold, administrative cruelty of her abandonment. He had cast her off with what he thought was nothing, a gesture meant to erase her from his life. And yet, that act of rejection had led her here. It had forced her into a ruin that held a secret salvation. She had been left for dead with only her name, and it was a name that had unlocked a door to the past and given her a future. A stranger, a soldier weary of fighting, had all chosen that same name as a shield, and in doing so had inadvertently protected her. He had left his savings and his story buried in the earth, a message of hope for whoever finds this place. She was the one who had found it. She was 20 years old and had been left for dead in the foothills. She had arrived with nothing but a memory held in a small, worn stone. And with that, she had inherited the earth and built a home upon it. It was the best inheritance she could have ever received. We tell stories about finding a home in the places others have forgotten, about the quiet strength it takes to rebuild a life from the ground up. The world is full of abandoned things, waiting for someone with the patience to see their value. If you believe in the power of starting over, in the grace that can be found in unexpected places, subscribe for more stories like Sarah's. We are grateful to have you here with us. And now, we'd like to ask you a question to carry with you. Let us know in the comments. What is one small thing you have kept that connects you to your past? A reminder of where you came from.